You probably think Stonehenge was a Druid temple. It wasn't. The main stone placements actually predate Druids by roughly a millennium. In fact, Druids came along more than 1,000 years after the stones were raised. And that's just the first of 7 big misconceptions we're going to clear up today. What you're about to hear are 7 surprising research-backed facts, including discoveries from 2024 and 2025 that change what we thought we knew about its purpose, the people who built it, the stones themselves, and even the way it sounds. One hint, at least one of those stones may have come from northern Scotland. Stonehenge isn't actually a henge. That brings us to the first surprising point. Stonehenge isn't actually a henge. The term might sound obvious, after all the word is in the name, but archaeologists use henge in a very specific way. The count is 1, a site must have an earthwork consisting of a circular or oval bank of soil with a ditch dug on the inside of that bank. At Stonehenge, the ditch sits on the outside instead, which throws it outside the rules. By the technical definition, the monument that gave us the word in the first place doesn't belong to that category at all. The difference might sound nitpicky, but it matters. When archaeologists classify monuments this way, the placement of banks and ditches isn't arbitrary. It reflects choices made by the builders thousands of years ago. Across Britain, dozens of henges fit the inside ditch pattern, and researchers believe this orientation-controlled movement into the space shaped how ceremonies unfolded or marked symbolic boundaries. Stonehenge's reversed layout sets it apart, which suggests its designers weren't simply copying a fad. They were making something deliberately different. The name stuck partly because it sounded catchy and partly because of a quirk in language history. Antiquarians were already calling the site Stonehenge centuries ago, and in the early 20th century, archaeologists carved off the henge ending and began using it as a label for a whole class of monuments. That's what linguists call backformation. We assumed there was a root word hiding inside, so one was created after the fact. The same thing happened with edit, coming after editor. In Stonehenge's case, the shortened version went from a misread ending to the official category term by the 1930s. Technically, that leaves us with a paradox. Archaeology textbooks list dozens of henge sites scattered across Britain and Ireland, but the most famous henge of all doesn't qualify. Instead of ditch inside bank, it's bank inside ditch. Scholars sometimes call it a proto-henge to signal its odd position in the family, and while some people like to joke about names such as anti-henge or backward henge, the truth is more serious. Stonehenge's unusual layout likely meant something to the builders, even if we don't know exactly what. That makes the monument both the parent and the misfit of its category. It gave us the word, but it doesn't obey the definition that word now describes. From the perspective of public imagination, however, Stonehenge became so widely recognized that any effort to rename it would be pointless. Tourists hear henge and think of massive stone rings, while archaeologists think of soil banks and inner ditches, sometimes without stones at all. In practice, Stonehenge is both, a stone circle layered onto an earthwork, but one that breaks the rules of the class it inspired. The lesson hidden in all this is that language shapes how we picture the past, even when the terminology starts as a mistake. Calling Stonehenge a henge creates an association with other prehistoric sites, but at the same time it blurs what makes this monument distinct. Understanding the mislabel helps us notice that the builders were doing something unusual on purpose. They weren't aligning exactly with the conventions of their time, which will become important once we start considering how the monument story unfolded. Because if the classification is already unconventional, we shouldn't expect the construction sequence to be neat and straightforward either. The construction timeline just got messier. If you've ever flipped open a history book, you've probably seen that neat chart showing Stonehenge being constructed between about 30,000 and 1500 BCE in a tidy sequence of phases. First comes the earthwork enclosure, then the post, then the stones, like a step-by-step manual. That clean picture has been popular for decades, but the more evidence we uncover, the less it looks like reality. Instead of a straight line, the construction story turns out to be uneven, overlapping, and sometimes unpredictable. Recent research and updated dating methods paint Stonehenge as a patchwork of episodes rather than a single master plan. The well-known ditch and bank enclosure probably went up around 3000 BCE, but from there the timeline becomes complicated. Timber. Post holes discovered under parts of the monument suggest that wooden structures once occupied the same footprint long before Sarsens or bluestones were installed. Farther afield, excavations at nearby sites such as Blickmead show that people had already been gathering and marking the Salisbury Plain landscape thousands of years earlier, shaping it into a ritual environment well before the stones arrived. This context matters because it changes how we think about purpose and intent. For a long time, archaeologists assumed the monument was the end product of a carefully executed vision planned across the centuries. But the evidence from timber circles and earlier activity shows something less rigid. Each new generation inherited whatever was left behind and repurposed it according to its own needs. One group may have built a timber monument, another may have translated the design into stone, and still another later rearranged the same stones to meet entirely new goals. Rather than marching through phases, the work seems to have come in bursts. For decades, the site might sit unchanged, then suddenly a major effort would shift its design. When communities returned to add, remove, or reconfigure elements, they weren't just continuing a project, they were reimagining it. The fallow periods and irregular resurgences leave us with a patchy record that resists being divided into neat chapters. The bluestones did not all arrive at once, and the Sarsens weren't simply put into position and left untouched. Some were dragged in, arranged into rings or horseshoes, then dismantled or repositioned by later builders. Certain circles are now understood as rearrangements of earlier settings, which makes it far more difficult to say what the original plan really was. Instead of a carefully tiered project, Stonehenge reflects centuries' worth of revision and adaptation. That refusal to stay tidy also affects textbook diagrams. You may remember those illustrations showing a series of arrows pointing from Phase 1 to Phase 4, gradually culminating in the iconic stone circle. Better dating has forced those arrows to crisscross. The timber post holes overlap chronologically with earthenworks, which overlap again with stone additions and later changes. Instead of 4 clean phases, we now see layers of construction that clash or overwrite each other, more like a palimpsest than a progressive sketch. This shift doesn't just change the timeline, it also reframes how we understand alignments and symbolism. Take the famous Midsummer Sunrise sightline. Early builders may not have intended it at all. It might only have crystallized after multiple resets of the layout over centuries. In other words, the solar symbolism so central to Stonehenge today could have been a late addition, one that emerged only after people kept moving stones into patterns that eventually acquired meaning. That perspective reshapes how we view the communities who built it. A neat, orderly sequence suggests one unified culture executing a vision together across hundreds of years. But what we see instead looks more like a conversation between generations. Woodland-based communities might have conceptualized the site in a certain way before stones came into use. Later, groups who value permanence may have imposed sarsens and bluestones as if to carve their identity in rock. Centuries afterward, still other groups rearranged the stones to suit new ceremonies or beliefs. Stonehenge was never one people's achievement. It was everybody's project, inherited and redefined many times over. That means the monument almost certainly served multiple purposes over its long life. Early iterations likely had spiritual or civic roles tied to gatherings in wooden circles. The switch to stone suggested a desire for permanence, endurance, or visual alignment with the heavens. Burials then appear in and around the enclosure, giving it yet another dimension. By the time later communities encountered the site, its layered meanings were baked into the ground. A ceremonial space, a cemetery, and a cosmic marker all rolled together. Every generation added a chapter, and none erased the chapters before. This reevaluation has also pulled earlier activity on the plain firmly into the discussion. At Blickmead, not far from Stonehenge, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of human presence reaching back to around 8000 BCE. They found traces of hearths, food remains, and environmental data showing people gathered there long before monumental construction. That doesn't mean anyone was raising massive stones in the Mesolithic, but it does confirm that Salisbury Plain had long been a significant gathering landscape. By the time communities began setting up ditches, timber posts, and later stones, they were tapping into a tradition of ritualized space that stretched back thousands of years. Thinking of Stonehenge as a long-term process rather than a single project also helps explain the mix of planning and improvisation. A generation might have imported bluestones only to shift them later. Another group could decide to rearrange the earthworks to match new social conditions. These decisions weren't accidents. They demonstrated the monument was a living site, a canvas altered and reinterpreted over time. One of the most striking elements of this ongoing revision is the scale of effort involved. Moving multi-ton stones across long distances or resetting them after generations of weathering was a formidable task, demanding communal labor. But those efforts happened unevenly, sometimes separated by centuries. Between those episodes, people may have continued to use the monument as it stood, gathering in whatever form it then had. That flexible use suggests the monument was never unfinished to the people involved. It was always active, always functional, whatever its current shape. When you view Stonehenge this way, the idea of a single fixed purpose becomes impossible. Instead, the monument reflects a dialogue stretching across 1,500 years, with each period adding to or redirecting the narrative. Perhaps what makes it so powerful is precisely that cumulative layering, that no one generation owned it completely, but every generation could leave its imprint. This makes Stonehenge feel less like a static ruin and more like a record of continuous cultural change. What appears today as a single stone circle was actually several different monuments layered together in the same spot over millennia. That complexity helps explain why scholars have debated its meaning for so long. Every interpretation captures part of the truth, because Stonehenge really did embody many different truths at different times, and that long sequence of rebuilding and redefining had consequences for how people experienced it. Each new layout did more than reshape the landscape visually. It also changed how the monument interacted with the people gathered there. Those shifts didn't just affect how Stonehenge looked from a distance, but how it felt to stand within it. The stones guided movement, framed sightlines, and even altered the sound of voices and instruments within the circle, which opens up an intriguing possibility. Stonehenge wasn't only a monument to see, but a space that could also transform what people heard. Stonehenge can actually sing. Stonehenge may look silent today, but research suggests it once had a voice of its own. This idea, often summed up as Stonehenge can sing, comes from surprisingly robust evidence. Instead of functioning only as a visual monument, many stones at the site also displayed distinct acoustic properties that would have transformed how gatherings sounded inside the circle. For decades, archaeologists assumed any noise at Stonehenge was incidental. Large stone surfaces reflect sound, so shouting or drumming would have produced echoes, but few imagine the monument itself contributing anything beyond that. The surprise came when experiments showed that Stonehenge does more than bounce noise around. Certain stones, particularly the smaller blue stones, can resonate. Struck directly or stimulated by surrounding vibrations, they emit clear, ringing tones, almost as if the stones are instruments in their own right. The blue stones make this intriguing because they were transported from over 200 kilometers away in the Pressy Hills of Wales, rather than sourced locally. When researchers tested similar rocks in those quarries, they discovered the same phenomenon. Locally, these rocks had even been used as ringing stones, tapped to create simple bells and rhythms. It now appears quite possible that prehistoric builders were aware of this special quality and chose the blue stones for more than their size or color. They may have valued how these stones sounded when struck. When arranged in arcs or partial circles, the blue stones don't just reverberate individually, they interact. Their vibrations can cancel or reinforce one another, creating fluctuating sound patterns across the enclosed space. Imagine a group chanting while drums pound inside Stonehenge. Instead of sounds simply echoing back, the stones themselves would begin to layer their own tones over the performance. For people participating thousands of years ago, that could have produced the impression of the monument resonating with them, responding as though alive. Tests confirm that this isn't just speculation. In 2020, Trevor Cox and colleagues at the University of Salford built a 1/12 scale model of Stonehenge and measured how sound behaved inside it. Using this scale replica in a controlled chamber, they found the monument amplified certain frequencies by about 4 decibels compared to open air and extended reverberation, beyond what the bare landscape would naturally provide. 4 decibels may not sound dramatic today, but in an ancient ritual setting, without stages or loud instruments, even a modest increase in projection could have concentrated attention inward and bound the group together. That matters because Stonehenge sits on a wide, open plain where sound normally disperses quickly. In such an environment, it's hard to control groups the size of hundreds. The stones created a rare acoustic pocket, a place where sounds not only held together longer, but also gained depth. Participants standing inside the circle would have experienced voices and instruments swelling into a collective resonance, while those outside may have heard much less. That disparity supports the view that ceremonies could have been staged for smaller inner gatherings where acoustics were most intense. This doesn't prove exclusivity was designing the Stonehenge, but it does make restricted inner circle performances plausible. At the same time, the Sarsen stones, the towering lighter sandstone trilithons, also contributed in their own way. Even without resonating like the blue stones, their size and spacing manipulated echoes and reflection. Together, the mixed stone types produce zones of enhanced sound, where shifting positions by just a few steps altered the intensity you heard. Like sitting in different seats of a concert hall, participants at Stonehenge likely experience acoustics that varied depending on location within the ring. Practical implications follow from this. If the monument reinforced certain pitches, group chanting or drumming could lock into those frequencies, making rituals feel coordinated without needing advanced instruments. Over time, communities may have discovered specific tones that worked well with the stones, effectively teaching themselves to play the monument. That would blur the line between percussion, voice, and architecture, turning Stonehenge into part of the performance rather than just a backdrop for it. To put this in context, rocks that ring when struck are not unheard of around the world. Many cultures have recognized and used such properties for centuries. What makes Stonehenge unusual is the scale. It gathered multiple ringing stones into a carefully arranged monument, mixing them with massive sarsens to build an environment that actively shaped how people experience sound. That deliberate transport of bluestones from Wales takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. It wasn't just about bringing raw material. It may have been about carrying the sound of a homeland into a new ceremonial center. One caveat is important. The acoustics we can test today are not identical to those of the past. In the 20th century, several stones at Stonehenge were re-erected and set into modern concrete bases. That restoration helped preserve the monument, but inevitably altered the way sound moved through it. This means present-day visitors, or even computer simulations based on the current standing arrangement, may not fully capture how rituals sounded thousands of years ago. Even so, scaled experiments like the Salford model allow researchers to approximate conditions before those changes. The recognition that Stonehenge resonated changes what the site represents. Rather than being viewed only as a static monument aligned with the sky, it begins to look like one of the earliest large performance spaces in the world. For participants, ceremonies would have combined chanting, drumming, firelight, and stone resonance into an overwhelming sensory experience. Striking a tone and hearing it return magnified through tons of ancient rock could easily be interpreted as a supernatural presence, either the voices of ancestors, the earth itself, or the gods. That doesn't mean Stonehenge was designed solely as an instrument, but its stone choices and arrangement suggest acoustics were at least a meaningful factor. The monument shaped sound in ways no open field could, and in a ritual culture where sound and song carried communal meaning, that affect would have been powerful, more powerful arguably than the monument's appearance alone. This auditory dimension may also explain why gatherings at Stonehenge felt transformative. Participants weren't just looking at stones, they were enveloped by a resonance that seemed greater than their own voices. Sound merged with architecture, so the boundary between human effort and natural response blurred. To ancient listeners, the stones answered back. In that sense, saying Stonehenge could sing is less a metaphor and more a reasonable description of what people heard. None of this reduces the importance of Stonehenge's precision with the heavens. On the contrary, the acoustic findings deepened the picture. If people gathered at certain times of year for ceremonies that resonated within the circle, they would have been equally attuned to the shifting positions of the sun and moon above them. Just as the stones amplified sound, their arrangement also highlighted recurring patterns in the sky. And that brings us to another revelation about Stonehenge. It was not only about what you could hear, but also about what you could see in relation to the movements of celestial bodies. The astronomical calendar theory just leveled up. Stonehenge isn't just about how it sounds when you stand inside it. The monument also appears to have been deeply tied to the movements of the sky, and our understanding of that role has changed dramatically in the past couple of years. Most people first hear about the famous midsummer solstice sunrise when it comes to Stonehenge. That's the one where, if you're standing in the right spot, the sun rises directly above the heel stone as the light pours across the central axis of the circle. It's a striking sight, and every June thousands of people gather to watch, making it one of the most familiar associations with the monument. For a long time, this was thought to be the main astronomical feature, a way to track the longest and shortest days of the year so early farmers could organize their agricultural calendar. But beginning in 2024 and running into 2025, new computer modeling and real-time sky tracking began to challenge that picture. Teams from English Heritage, the Royal Astronomical Society, and several universities, including Bournemouth, Oxford, and Leicester, have been reconstructing what the sky would have looked like over Stonehenge thousands of years ago. They adjusted for changes in the tilt of the Earth's axis and other astronomical shifts, then tested how the movements of the sun and moon lined up with the stones. What they found suggested something more ambitious. The alignments might not only capture the solstices we already know about, but also key phases of the moon's much longer cycle. In particular, recent attention has focused on the so-called lunar standstills. These occur roughly once every 18.6 years, when the moon reaches its extreme northernmost and southernmost rising and setting points on the horizon. During a major standstill, the moon looks like it strays much farther than usual across the sky, rising and setting in unusually wide arcs. Observers in 2024 and 2025 have been able to witness this rare event for themselves, and Stonehenge has become a kind of natural laboratory where archaeologists, astronomers, and even the public can watch how the stones interact with this unusual lunar behavior. This matters because solstices are relatively easy to notice, even without instruments. After repeated years of watching, you'll see when the light reaches its farthest point and reverses. But the nearly 2-decade cycle of the lunar standstill is another matter entirely. It requires multiple generations of observers to remember where the moon rises at its extremes, and then to recognize when that pattern repeats. Constructing a monument that captures that rare horizon position implies not only careful observation, but also a system for passing down knowledge beyond a single lifetime. Some of the oddities in the layout of Stonehenge begin to make more sense in this light. Several uprights aren't aligned directly with solar paths, which raise questions for earlier researchers. But when plotted against the standstill positions of the moon, those misalignments fall into place. From designated viewpoints within the stone circle, the moon at its extremes would appear framed between specific uprights. That suggests Stonehenge wasn't a single-purpose calendar for the sun, but had a dual function, encapsulating both solar and lunar markers in a single structure. There's also a tantalizing link to eclipses. Astronomers today know that eclipses often occur near lunar standstills, since that is when the geometry of the Earth, Sun, and Moon line up in ways that allow them to cross paths. Some researchers have suggested that if the builders recognized lunar standstills, they might have also observed that unusual eclipses follow with greater frequency around the same times. To be clear, there's no evidence they can predict the exact day of an eclipse. This is not a prehistoric version of a modern prediction engine. But it's possible they were able to recognize when the conditions were right for these startling events. This capacity would have given enormous significance to the communities capable of reading the stones in this way. Still, scholars caution against stretching the evidence too far. The idea of Stonehenge as a neat 365.25-day calendar with 12 months and 4 seasons, as proposed by some studies, is not widely accepted. In fact, experts like Magley and Belmonte have published critiques pointing out flaws in those specific claims. What most researchers today will agree on is narrower, but still impressive. There is solid support for the solstitial alignments, growing evidence that lunar standstills may also be encoded, and the possibility that those dual markers carry knowledge of eclipse conditions. Within academic circles, the exact degree of intentionality remains debated, but consensus supports the view that astronomy mattered. The 2025 findings highlight another archaeological insight. Building with such precision meant that labor and design choices were not random. Moving multi-ton Sarsen stones into place required enormous coordination. If those stones really were oriented to capture rare events like lunar standstills, then builders were not simply stacking rocks, they were deliberately inscribing cycles into the landscape. The implication is that prehistoric communities were capable of far more long-term planning and recording than the stereotype of illiterate, unscientific societies might suggest. The simulations also show how people inside the circle would have perceived these alignments. When researchers placed a virtual viewer inside the reconstructed model, they found that the sightlines are exact only from very particular positions. This means the design may have choreographed where participants stood, funneling them toward specific viewing stations during ceremonies. The monument may have been guiding behavior, dictating where leaders spoke or where gatherings faced, with the stones themselves functioning as the frame for cosmic events. Thinking about Stonehenge this way transforms it from a static ruin into an active tool of instruction. Every standstill, every solstice, every repeated sky event would create opportunities for communities to renew their shared knowledge. A younger generation would know where to stand and what to watch, inheriting information not through written records, but through lived experience inside the monument. By bringing people back repeatedly to witness cycles, the structure itself became the archive. The implications extend far beyond southern England. Other monument-building cultures around the world, from Chaco Canyon in North America to early sites in Mesopotamia, kept records of lunar extremes in architectural form. The fact that Stonehenge may share this feature places Britain on a much broader web of prehistoric sky-watching traditions. It suggests that different societies independently saw value in carving long astronomical cycles into their most enduring structures, cycles that reached far beyond one lifespan and thus required stones instead of stories to preserve. That level of preservation would have been crucial in a farming society, knowing exactly when to plant or when to expect harsher seasons to shape survival. If leadership groups controlled the monument, then they controlled access to knowledge about time itself. Holding ceremonies that demonstrated such mastery of the sky could reinforce authority and social cohesion. In that case, Stonehenge wasn't just an observatory. It doubled as a stage for showing that leaders held insight the wider community could trust. And yet it's important not to turn every interpretation into certainty. Some of the alignments may be intentional, some may be coincidental, and ongoing projects are still testing which is which. The fact that Stonehenge has become a site of active observation again, in precisely the years of an ongoing major lunar standstill, illustrates how much we still stand to learn. Researchers in 2024 and 2025 set up instruments and invited the public to witness how the moon interacts with the stones, using the skies today to test hypotheses about skies seen thousands of years ago. The cautious conclusion is this: Stonehenge remains one of the earliest large-scale monuments to link human society with the rhythms of the heavens, and its complexity keeps impressing us.